Hello and welcome to this conversation with Professor Kirti Trivedi on the fractal nature of Indian temple architecture. It's a well-known fact that many cities of ancient and medieval India grew around temples. One only has to think about the Brihadishwara temple of Tanjavur, which was at the heart of the Chola Empire, or the temple complex at Hampi, which was at the heart of the Vijayanagar Empire. Any traveler visiting an Indian city today cannot miss the various temples of different sizes dedicated to various deities dotting the cityscape. There are certain striking features about the visual appeal of these temples, including the jaggedness on the sides of these temples, the repetition of motifs, the notion of iteration in design. And anyone who studied complexity knows that ideas of self-similarity and iteration are at the heart of fractal geometry. So in this talk, in this discussion, we will have Kirti tell us about how it is that temples came to have this fractal nature. He links this back to very fundamental ideas in Indian philosophy and cosmology about the universe and our place in it, and how these ideas find their way into the algorithmic processes laid down in the architectural texts of ancient India. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Thanks so much, Kirti, for joining us today. We've spoken before, and my introduction to your work was through that 1989 paper, which is now 36 years old, on the fractal geometry of Hindu temples in India. And, I found that to be really interesting because both Nishant and I, we work in complex systems. There are certain themes that sort of come up in all sorts of places, and which are the hallmarks of complexity. And, fractality is obviously, one of them. And your paper was actually particularly interesting also because of something you just mentioned a little before, which is the fact that going back in time, if you look at the algorithms, as you mentioned, of Indian temple construction and design, that they really, get into these aspects of, discretization and fractalization, the use of recursion, all of which actually produces those kinds of, complex structures.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, please.
My point in this is all these are just verbal instructions. There are no drawings. When you go to some Rangan Sutradhar, the entire temple is described in verses, because every action or a large action is given a name. So if you use that name, it describes the whole procedure. So this is very fascinating because it's how things are happening now, So the complexity, very simple, describable processes. And just given enough time, it looks so complex, you can't even understand. Same happens with natural structures. Given enough time, they become complex, but steps are very simple and recursive.
Yeah, which is again going back to complex systems. I mean, it's a hallmark of complex systems that something that over time has evolved into seemingly complex, patterns and behavior actually can emerge from very sort of simple sets of rules and interactions.
Right.
So, Professor Kirti, to get us started, let's start at the very basics to, ask this question of what is a fractal? Let's begin there. What is a fractal?
Fractal, actually, as defined by Mandelbrot, it's the idea of continuity of dimensions, not dividing in single dimensions. The Euclidean geometry, 1 or 2 or 3 he proposed that it's endless, and within that endlessness, like your hair, at different magnitudes, it keeps on changing its dimension. So this itself is a very interesting idea. I mean, something which we continue to believe for so long was dismissed with his single discovery that mountains are not cones, clouds are not spheres. It was a revelation, actually, Mandelbrot's work.
Exactly. And this notion that, you had this sort of self-similarity across a wide range of scales that, a tree is like a great example of that, you sort of look at a branch, you look at a twig, you even look inside a leaf. I mean, they all seem to have the same basic structure. And, as you said, fractals abound in nature, whether it be trees or coastlines. And now you also sort of talk in great detail about how fractals sort of emerge in temple architecture, right? So before we go into the fractal geometry of Hindu temples, I think, if you can talk to us a little bit about, what is it about Indian philosophy or cosmology that sort of leads us into these algorithms that give us fractals? Like what underlies these, this fractalization?
So I remember when Ranjit Makuni was editor of that Computers magazine, which first published the article. And when I sent it, he replied saying, this is the first paper which talks about semantics of architecture. I mean, the architecture of the temple is not just a physical structure. Every component of it is trying to express a meaning. And that fundamental meaning is how we view the world to be, like holonomic and recursive and so many of those things. And they are in every component. So the whole, for example, when I did my first presentation and explained the idea of circle being represented with square pixels only. That's the convention the Vastu scientist created. You increase the number of divisions from 4 to 4 to 9 to 9, you get finer outline, but it's still jagged. And this thought that the world is circular, but has to be represented, the cosmos is circular. These are meanings assigned to geometric shapes, that circle and square. And what we create is square, and circle has to be created with square means. This itself, to me, was a very profound thought. And many people said they were not able to draw spheres, so they created this kind of language. But if you see the sculptures on the temple walls, all the female figures, in Raja Bhoj, Samrangan Sutradhar, there is a whole chapter on how the breasts should be modeled. That is a half sphere. So they knew how to do a sphere. Also, the path to creating the circular part of a shivling. If you see the books on iconography, they never use a compass to find a center and then make a circle and do like this. First of all, you make a square pillar, then you make it 8-sided, then you make it 16 and 32 and 64. It approaches a circle. So it's like imbued in every single state this idea that we can only approach something, but we can never recreate, because it will always be an approximation. And this is not a like simple idea. It's a profound thought, no? That you define your means, you know the limitations of that, and based on that create the whole structure.
Right. In fact, I think in the paper I remember reading, you had mentioned that all temples generally have a sort of a square, base, which represents. I think you mentioned that represents the cosmos, and then the circle represents the earth within that cosmos, and that sort of that
Yeah.
circle and square, as you mentioned, that creates the jaggedness and this structures that
line I
mentioned.
found in Vastu Sutra Upanishad. This, assigning values to circle and the square. But there is an earlier work, Poshkar Samhita. It's a series of 25 mandalas, which people used to do. According to me, it's a basic design program for architects to learn the complexity which accompanies growth. I will share this with you. So growth does not mean simply scaling. The baby doesn't scale and become big in absolute sense. Many more components emerge, things change. So it is that in the beginning of that work, there is a chapter that the mandala need not be square. It can be any shape. It can be triangular. It can be circular. It can be whatever you assign. We just happen to take a square because it's easiest to construct. It's very easy to divide and subdivide and whatever. So it was more a convenience. And they have given these federal mandalas, which have other shapes. So it's merely assigning square certain value, and that makes it so prevalent. But it could equally would have been triangular, and all mandalas would have become triangular. So this is also a very interesting idea. That
Right.
out of so many possibilities, we picked one, but doesn't mean all other possibilities don't exist. And it's stated clearly. And recently, I came across a verse in one of the Upanishads, which is very significant. I'll share it with you. It means if the world was imagined by somebody, it would not have existed. So this is beautiful. It's not somebody's imagination that things are like this. They are processes in which different elements combine, and the whole structure is process driven. It's not every tree is process driven. Nobody, I don't know. Do you know Hindi?
Yeah.
Okay, there is a very famous song. ये किस कवि की कल्पना का चमत्कार है. So which poet dreamed of this world? So the Upanishad thing says, if it was imagined by something, the diversity would not exist, which exists. There no two things are identical. So this also, so suddenly you get into a situation which is way profound than how simple they look, and like 2000 years ago.
Right. So, just on that, when you think about, the key features of temples in India, and this I'm saying that irrespective of, because India is also very, diverse in terms of the design of temples across the country, as in everything else. I was just going to ask you, like, are these ideas, these processes that you talk about, right? These algorithms that create these fractal structures. Do you see that across all this diversity, that whether you go north, south, west, east, that these, recursion and jaggedness and, all this sort of repetition across scales. Are those motifs and themes that you see everywhere?
Across India?
Yeah, across India.
Actually, they have three general categorization is three styles, but essentially they are same. I mean, actually, I taught in NTU when I was there visiting professor, a course in Islamic design. And that point, I got to study deeply both the Holy Quran and their way of construction. So even in our tradition, all the deities or all the divine energies, the first description, the most dense description is the seed syllable, the Bij mantra. So you say Gam or you say Klim, that describes all. It's like the logo of a company, no? If you see B and O, it brings all the characteristics. So just meditating on that will bring all the characteristics. Next stage is a geometrical diagram, which we call mandala or yantra. So mantra, mandala, and the most gross or anthropomorphic is the murti, where we make it in a human form. Yeah. Now, Islamic architecture also tries to understand the structure of the universe, but they study it on a structural level only, at geometry only, and the play of geometry which creates everything, and they don't convert it in the next one like we do, because they think you get caught in the image then and forget the root structure. So that way, Islamic art is more pure. It's more close to understanding something. I was very fascinated. Essentially, they are same, but they leave it at that point. No?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had one question on so in your paper you go through the idea of like you simply explain what a self-similar shape is. You add two shapes, you kind of create a self-similar pattern, and then you over recursive, processes, you create a much more complex shape, and that obviously you refer back to Mandelbrot and his explanations towards it. My question to you was actually more simple, right? Like, how did you identify these in temples? To what scales do they exist? How would you characterize the self-similarity patterns that you observe in temples to more, conventional physics identifications of fractals?
I think it was a combination of factors. Most because the theoretical part of temple architecture, the theoreticians, they are no more. All the architectural works we have, all the shelf shastras, they are just manuals for craftsmen. So they just describe the procedures which you execute. You hardly accept Vastu Sutra Upanishad. There is no work which describes the theory or the principles behind it, how it should be done. So because the practice died, it was completely taken over in India by British people set up architectural schools. So the entire Shastra temple making, even recent Indian writers like Satish Grover and all have called it mumbo jumbo, that it's all superstition. But the procedures are there and the temples are there. So it can't be like nonsensical. The structures are standing. So what happens at this point, they're only Sanskrit scholars. But all Vastu texts are technical texts. And in technical text and engineering text, words have different meanings. So many of the translations don't make sense. In my case, I was interested in temple architecture for a very long time. Just Actually, one Italian designer had come and he had taken, and then my Japanese guru said, go and study. And I also know object making and engineering and design. So having these two inputs in one mind allowed me to immediately see the similarity between fractal points and temples, because Sanskrit scholars will never see a Mandelbrot book. They will remain in their words. So it's an accident that I could connect. And as soon as I found it was after a TIFR lecture, I knew this is the way it is. So you look at an ellipse and how the corner, the jaggedness comes, and you find exact correspondence in temples, then you don't have to refer to any more text. You know, you understood it's like this. So all further reading just brings out more facets of the same, which you didn't see. So then I went on to columns and temple columns and how such diversity came. We are now researching. I'm doing the Museum of Raja Bhoj, who has written the most comprehensive book on architecture, Samrangan Sutradhar. And he describes, they never describe one, they always describe a sequence from small to big, so 25 temples. And their descriptions again are process generated where number of steps increase, which generates more complexity. So Oscar Samhita Mandala, and these things just sort of connect together like a jigsaw puzzle. No? They clarify the thing more and more. And then we are now doing the ceilings based on the description, which are negative 3D forms. Temple is a solid form, but if you see from below the ceiling, it's a negative form, it's carved out. So within that, all the variations. So it keeps getting very interesting. There are 4 layers of people involved in making a temple. So the topmost is the Acharya. He's the person who conceives and visualizes how it should be made. He's the thinker actually. And from there comes Isthapati. So that concept is converted by somebody who knows buildings. So that he's the architect. And then we have Sutradhar. He's the person who manages the whole construction. Because building a temple in that time, it's like a 50 or 60-year project, all stones to be put on top and all. And last of all are Takshaks. They are the people who carve the stone. And so different set of instructions exist for all of these and different capabilities, because these are major projects to be managed and done. Actually, the king knows in his lifetime it will not be complete, but he will still do the project to make something like Kailash temple, which is carved from a single rock inside out.
So, Kirti, just to sort of pick up on this, can you, we've established that there is this link that flows from, whatever, Indian philosophy, cosmology to temple design, and that sort of finally shows up in these fractal forms. Can you talk a little bit about, because many people would have been to temples, would have seen temples. What are some very, very typical design aspects of a temple that are fractal in nature? Right. I think one thing you mentioned, for instance, is the shivling, which, you can think of it as a square or a cube that is sort of chiseled finer and finer till you get a semicircle or a hemisphere
we
at
only
the top.
see the circular part, no? We only see the circular part, but the 2 more parts which are embedded in the base. First is a square, then octagonal, then You know the term Vishwakarma?
I've heard the term, yes.
Yeah, Vishwakarma means maker of the universe. So all form givers, architects, designers, sculptors are all their god. They worship Vishwakarma. And Vishwakarma means the one who made everything. And the basic advice is we should make as the maker of the universe makes things. So basically, it involves understanding the algorithms of natural creation and using them to make things, whatever. And that's what we are trying to do. We are revising because as opposed to this is intuitive form creation, that you get an idea and you randomly sketch till you like it. Here, there is no question of subjective judgment. No, you start a process and you go through a certain number of steps, it gets finished. And depending on the scale, and it's inherent when you start, just like, so there is the concept of man. They say if something is made according to measure, it glows on its own with divinity. So every single existing thing has its own, it's not physical measure, it's the inner measure. How much something will grow from the same seed, one may become just a 6-inch plant and one may grow to be very big. So it's the inherent measure that decides your scale, and that decides how it will unfold. So to try to understand all that, and depending on the money available, because there is always a yajman. There is always a person who commissions a temple. It used to be the king, but the rich people also commission the temple. So depending on their capacity to spend, you could choose how big a structure you want to create. So right from putting the first stone, it's not like you start with a brick and decide to add 4 more floors afterwards. These are like organisms. So once you decide something, it will only culminate in something of that size. You want to make it bigger, you have to begin with a bigger possibility right from the beginning. So this is also very interesting, actually. Not enough has been written about it or described. Otherwise, Corbusier will not get credit for modular, because module is built into all temple structure. They say if you find one stone, you can calculate the height of the temple. It's that kind of vision.
In Southeast Asia, you notice that, they also have temples there. And very much the same sort of motifs and designs you see there. This fractal nature still very much shows up in those, though, there are certain ways in which they are, particularly Thai or Cambodian. But there is a certain essence in which following these rules has produced similar kinds of, jaggedness and repetition and recursion in those shapes as well. I wonder if you've had a chance to, also explore those and see if,
I
are there essential
visited
differences?
all of them. So all the temples there do not have the variation which temples in India have, because they were taught this. So they followed and replicated exactly the same model. But in India, the persons who created temple forms were individual creators who created in a given framework, and they were allowed to innovate. So there is much more variety in Indian temples. Like you have 1,000 pillars and every side is different. So it's very difficult to assume that somebody sketched all those and gave them to carvers. So there is a whole guild of sculptors who all work in the same style and same visual framework, and they are given one pillar each, and it's defined what you have to do, and within that they show off their creativity, which gives the variation. It's like I take a class of 32 students, I just define the framework. So they belong to the framework, but each one is different. The same thing you don't find in Vietnam. So in the temple itself, God is sitting down. That murti is achal murti. That means it doesn't move. And they have another idol which is processional. So when they take it out in a procession, the processional idol will go. So temple itself is a static form of a dynamic cosmos where it's sitting at rest. But when it goes around in a Rathyartha, when it gets wheels, it becomes the dynamic cosmos. And so all the attributes of those come in. So it's very interesting to compare because the horses don't have their feet on the ground. They are up in the air. So all these things which appear like so just mythology or what actually have much deeper philosophical concepts behind them, which drives every aspect of their creation. Those who create know them by heart, by tradition. We only have makers now. We don't have thinkers anymore. That's why Indian temple architecture has not evolved. If you see Islamic mosques, you see in Malaysia or Dubai, they have developed new contemporary manifestations of minars and whatever. But Indian architecture is stuck because thinkers are missing, according to me.
Actually, that was one question I sort of had for you, which is to say, when you sort of wrote about this fractal nature in 1989, which is now 36 years back. And you mentioned a lot about the fact that the way the temple construction or the design and construction of temples is written down as process and algorithms. What are some of the, the core texts? I think you mentioned that we don't know who the people were, but what are some of the core texts that lay down these processes? What are the ones that you've studied in the course of the last, 30 odd years?
Because I can read Gujarati and Sanskrit and Hindi, and the names are given in various works. I managed to collect everything, all the Vastu Shastras, all the work from Sompuras, all Sanskrit works, all originals, English, French translation, everything. But most of them, like I said, they are manuals for the maker, for the fellow who is going to make. So they're just simple instruction is to follow. He said, take so many, divide into so many parts, take this, divide again. They're just instruction. They never explain why it should be done. Till I came to Vastu Sutra Upanishad. So there is another variation of that called the Shilpa Rahasya Upanishad. Both they're 80% identical text. So they explain the philosophy of form creation. Actual thing is just 6 pages because it's in sutra form. But that is the deepest philosophy, and everything derives from that. Then they express it in the form of a sutra, which is a very small, very precise, dense statement, which is always true. And Upanishads are compilation of all these statements. Regular mathematics instruction, though in engineering you do up to MSc level, but we never had a good teacher. So I never understood mathematics. I'm not a mathematics person. But my Japanese guru, Professor Sugiura, when I started study of temple architecture, he said, don't read books. Don't read any books, just go and see them. Because all of these structures are meant to communicate. And if you watch them long enough and with attention, they will reveal their meaning to them because they are pieces of visual communication. If you read a book, the filter of the book writer will come and will take you in another direction because nobody writes without bias. And so I directly studied, I visited many, many times. Each time you go, some new understanding comes. You belong to the culture, you understand the meaning. We are a visual culture, so we can differentiate.
I have a question actually directly to this, because in your paper also you describe the patterns of or the process of making structures within, say, temples. They resemble or kind of remind you of things that you learn in like graphic design, and the idea of like different techniques, etc. So I was just wondering, can you like expand on that? How would you make that parallel out to somebody who probably has not understood that?
So actually I learned my design in the Western way, where you develop an idea by sketching or by visual thinking intuitively. You make many variations till you like something, then you refine. So this is one way of creating, and it depends on you getting an idea. If you don't get an idea, you are stuck. So it's a random method. Some become very good at making very beautiful structures just teaching. But my Japanese guru, he works parametrically and very, very structural process driven form variation. So he said, rather than designing one flower, we should design the program by which you can make all the flowers. Then you just vary the parameters, endless variety emerges. And this is essentially the same thinking as Indian temples or Indian construction. So that's the beauty. I mean, the whole thought, it's so visible in his work. He never repeats. It's because you just change one value once you add it, and another series emerges. So endless variety happens. Just how many? We just have eyes, eyebrows, nose, mustache, lips, and 7.5 billion people all look different. Just by this is complexity, huh? And variation. So I tend to follow this second method because it's closer to the way we have been doing all the time. The Indian way of doing.
Yeah. Actually, somewhat of a, just maybe very subjective, or maybe it's not. I think even in your paper, you talk about this, that when you see something that has this sort of a fractal nature, as someone who's viewing it or experiencing it, I don't know if you used the word profound. I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but I thought it was really interesting because it's one thing to talk about the process that generates the structure, but is there something about this kind of fractal design and our human sort of response to it? Are we sort of, given that you're also a designer and an architect, how do you see that relationship? Is there something there, or is it like any other design? We like it because it's aesthetic and beautiful. or is there something particular there?
So the key thought, it comes in Sankhya philosophy, is tanmatra. Tanmatra means that alone. Tanmatra, that alone. I mean, everything has an essence, which means that thing. Like cup has cupness and mug has mugness, and any person also, you have anandness, I have kirtiness. So that alone is the reality. The physical structure which grows around Anand or Kirti is transient, constantly changing. So it may manifest as physicality, but it does not reside in physicality. It has its own independent structure. So to find the isness of something, whatever you are making, and then give it form. So which means you can vary it, let's say, types of dogs. No, they are very large and very cat-like dogs, but you never confuse, and every human being is able to recognize that this animal is a dog. So an Alsatian also, and a puppy also. So this thought itself is very interesting because it's undefinable, but everyone can recognize. If you and the more we know somebody, the more closely we understand the essence. So another thing, another shlok tells, Jnanam vastu tantram, na manushya tantram. So knowledge of something is in that thing itself, not in its description. It's the same idea as Professor Sugira said. Don't read about the tree, go and watch the tree. You will understand better. So I think all these thoughts combined together create a way of constructing or making things which is much more profound than any other creative outcome by any other culture.
What are some of the other sort of directions that the work has taken from that time, where you sort of saw these things, you sort of write about them? What are the ways in which these fractal structures emerge? Are there other newer ideas that you're exploring in relation to both temple and fractality, or even, as the theme of, does it even go beyond temples in the way in which other things were built, or as that scope expanded in some
Actually,
sense?
that first article got uh, was like appreciated all over. It got published in Japanese, and it so I wrote in sequence three more, one on columns and pillars, and one on differentiation techniques. Then the work remained dormant because I do many things. I'm a full-time teacher in IIT, very active design professional, and my own researches and whatever. It remained dormant. But from last 3 years at the Center for Design Studies, I have not, the teachers I've hired can write code and they can create models, not as using an application program, but beginning from scratch. So this whole activity has started again, like I showed you the temple research. So I have given different components to them. I have an integral understanding of the temple form, and they are trying to recreate. And the results are very interesting. So whole thing has become alive again. That's why I want to invite you and sort of add a further input so we can do. Because the world has to know about it. It's not been written about in sufficient depth. More works are Sanskrit, or books no one reads. It appears too complex for normal, but it's another level altogether of human creation. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, I had one question, I think that just follows up from this and also a previous question, right? So I think also in your paper, like the petal example, I think in your paper you give the snowflake kind of example, right? So you say self-similar
Actually,
patterns.
it was a computer magazine.
Yeah.
Visual Computer was the magazine. And already it went to Mandelbrot for reviewing. And he said this paper has nothing to do with computer graphics, but must be published. So if I talk about temple alone, it won't be considered fit for publishing in Visual Computer. So I had to bring in all this snowflakes and Mandelbrot things to make it look like it has to do something. But basically, it's Indian philosophy, actually, that whole paper.
No, and the reason I ask is that I think um, since you made those connections anyway for that, would you have gone across to see that elements in temple architecture have they evolved over time? Like if you take the first temple or the earliest temple that you have visited to the one that you visited, probably that was constructed the last. I know all of them were constructed quite a while back, right? And some of them we can't even date. But was there some sort of evolution of these techniques that you saw? I know the framework, like you said, exists, but did people start playing around with more,
In
shapes?
1981, in IIT Bombay, where I teach, I started a course called Indian Thought and Traditions, in which we explained one by one all our classical tradition, one of which was temple architecture. So I had asked Director IIT, this is after my Japanese guru gave me the advice, you know enough about the Western world, now try to understand India. So I took permission from Director IIT. He gave me a vehicle and a driver and a research assistant. We visited, we traveled all over India for 1 year. So it's the accumulated images of all the temples you see, which brings some understanding. So when finally the idea of fractal came and I saw all that, it just all connected together in a flash, that's how it happened. I call it an accident that I had those inputs and they simply, the conclusion was obvious that it's the same thing. It's there in nature. If the forces are same, the pattern created are similar, like wind over sand dunes in a desert, and you have haldika powder in a plate, and you move and you get nearly same patterns because the forces involved are same. So it's that kind of intuitive understanding.
Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you soon.